Hey everybody, I am Matthew Cutie and welcome to another AMA with Holo and Holochain. This is AMA number 27, depending on where you are in the world. Today is June 11th. All right, so some introductions. We are supposed to have David Atkinson, our commercial director, joining us today, but David is on a little bit of a whirlwind tour through, at the moment, he's in Istanbul, Turkey. He'll be in Kiev, Ukraine soon as well. And unfortunately, in Turkey today, he found himself in a place that didn't have very good internet. So he is probably not going to be able to join us this time. But we do have with me Arthur Brock, the co-founder of Holochain and Holo. Hey, Art.
Hey, Matthew. Good to be here. And David still may be joining us briefly, right? Like he said he might come back and jump on.
Yep. Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see how that one pans out. I'm going to go ahead and start with some quick thank yous. Once again, we'd like to thank our collaborators, contributors, supporters, community builders, partners, and app and platform creators who all share the vision of a more distributed internet. Special thanks to those who are writing, reviewing, and or creating developer and community resources to increase engagement and awareness. We encourage you to learn about Holochain. Check out developer.holochain.org, where the resources are available to help you build your first Holochain app. Some quick announcements. We have some exciting events and meetups scheduled for the second quarter of 2019. We've got events happening in Perth, Austin, Texas, Melbourne, Byron Bay, Sydney, Seattle, London, Switzerland, Amsterdam, Oklahoma City, and more. Arthur, is there anything you want to say before we dive into the questions?
Just it's been a long time since I've been on an AMA. A lot of the other team members have been handling this, and so it's kind of good to be back. And I understand there have been some questions targeted specifically to me, so hopefully I can answer people's questions.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be a fun one. And as for those of you who actually watch a number of these, you've picked up on the fact that I am almost always on the road. And so I am yet again at a Starbucks. I feel like I'm on the Starbucks global tour at the moment. This time I am calling in from Malibu, California. All right, first question. This is kind of a fun one. What would you title your autobiography? Art, do you have an answer for that one?
This wasn't highlighted in my color. I didn't know I was answering this one. No, I don't know.
I'll start with mine, and then you can think about yours. I think I would call mine In Between Surfs, or something like that, or In Between Surf Sessions, because I've had the fortunate of having a very interesting life, and lots of, obviously at the moment I'm getting to do some really interesting stuff, right? With Holochain, this is kind of groundbreaking, change the world work. I've gotten to go to over 30 countries in the last year and a half. There's all of the things, right? And a big constant in my life is surfing, though it's been less constant over this last year and a half with all that travel. But that has been something that's anchored me and is it felt like an appropriate foil for me. It was something that was more consistent in my life than just about anything else. Art, what about you? What would you title your autobiography?
I don't know. Something eclectic. Feel like
A life eclectic?
Something like that. Yeah.
Feel like a life aquatic, but
only if I can get Steve Zissou on.
You are Steve Zissou. What are you talking about? All right.
Yeah.
All right. Good enough there. Thanks, everybody. Here's our next question. Apart from creating a currency and charging a transaction fee, have you thought of any other potential business models that could work on Holochain? I'm having a hard time coming up with a distributed business model that doesn't rely on a special user to grant access to certain apps, features, etc. I do feel that in the same way that Holochain creates a new computing paradigm, the same will emerge in business models, but I don't see it yet. Give me some inspiration. Art?
Well, for one thing, I think basically Holochain is not a magic wand to solve your business problem. It's basically a new infrastructure that can lower some of your infrastructure costs, we think, by people self-hosting, and but it doesn't replace having a business model. Most existing business models, I think, actually still work. Like if you think of all the Web 2.0 apps, and what I mean by that is the ones that get most of their value from user contribution or participation. So like Wikipedia, eBay, LinkedIn, Airbnb, Uber, Twitter, Facebook, Slack, big companies in the web space, right? Their business models still work, meaning donations, service charges, subscriptions, freemium ads. You could still do those kinds of things with Holochain. I think Holochain will give rise to some new business models. I'm not sure all of what those are going to be, but I think the business model that it mostly kills off is kind of the one about we're going to hold your data prisoner and have exclusive access and control over it. You know, like when that's the heart of the value proposition that somebody's charging for, meaning they've imprisoned your data, they control your choices and your user interface, and you know they sell your privacy to third-party advertisers, compromise your identity, can turn off your account at any time, you know, those kinds of things. My question is really, how can the businesses who rely on that business model compete against new ones that actually give you control of your data, the Web 3.0 approach on Holochain? I think the competitive advantage of giving users this kind of control of their data and everything will continue to rise in value, especially as we see more and more data breaches and, you know, identity theft. And, you know, like what's the latest one was like 700 million accounts compromised from Facebook, or, you know, like it's just crazy that, you know, to even set up that kind of centralized target for hackers. So I think there's a lot of real reasons to switch, business reasons.
Yeah, I'll just add a little sugar on top, which is, you know, we're starting this AMA a little late, in part because Google controls their interfaces and they change them or update something on the back end, and we've had this happen a few times now where we end up having a hiccup last minute, right? We've checked everything 3 times, and then all of a sudden, something changes, and we aren't able to do a live AMA because we're relying on Google's platform for hosting this. And unfortunately, we don't have, you know, an alternative built yet. We're working on that, but we're working on enabling those kinds of things, but we don't have that yet. So we're having to make do with what we got. All right, next up. Does Holochain open any new possibilities in the field of AI? So I'll just riff a little bit on this, but then I want to hear from Arthur, because Arthur actually has a degree in artificial intelligence. I think, yes, I think Holochain is going to have a major impact in the field of artificial intelligence, in part because the way that Holochain thinks about the functioning of a system is, I believe, much closer to how intelligence actually works in the real world than the current models of machine learning in the AI world. Right now, the primary philosophy driving the existing approaches to artificial intelligence has to do with some, let's call it computer or set of computers, having access to giant amounts of raw information from across, let's say, the entirety of the globe, a la all the things that Google is seeing or Facebook is seeing, et cetera. Them being able to vacuum up all of that data and then try to extract insights from it is sort of where the state of the art is in the AI world today. But that misunderstands intelligence from my perspective. That thinks of intelligence as being about, essentially as being about control, as being about some central thing that can see and make predictions, and et cetera. And I see intelligence rather as much more of a process, an emergent process where things are able to be tried, and ones that work can propagate, and patterns that don't work are able to die out without causing catastrophic failure. Right? The real key is the constraint of the costs of failure. And in that context, membranes are really important. the ability for some, let's say, two parties to try something out and be able to have that not, let's say it's just, it's me and my friend Billy. Me and Billy being able to try something out and not necessarily having everybody in the world know about what we tried, and thus having potentially a lifelong consequence in terms of our reputation because we wanted to experiment with drugs or try building some new thing or look at organizing a union or whatever, right? And that inability for parties to constrain their risks in a context where you have a source that's able to see everything is a big issue. I think at the end of the day, what you actually end up having in a distributed system akin to the kinds of ecosystems that Holochain is seeking to enable is far richer experimentation and learning. And some of that can be entirely machine-based, sensor networks and things like that, and various algorithms being tried. But much of it will actually be interfacing with other elements, right? Those sensors are a point of interface between these, let's say, digital signaling systems and the physical real world, whether that temperature is detecting heat or receiving information about light or sound or something else. So I think that's probably enough clarity from me. Art, thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to throw a weird one in, which has to do with kind of like the internet age of information and fake news and Snopes and how fake news is actually a hard problem. Like, what do you consider a reliable source of information? How do you know the original sources of information? Even if you take things that are like normally, considered pretty, I don't know, reliable. I don't know. I'm just thinking of like climate change data based on global temperature collections of data and different things like that, weather patterns. How do you know that data hasn't been tampered with by somebody with some kind of political agenda, one way or another? Because the problem is that data, as it's handled today in this data-centric way, as if data has first-order existence, its own independent truth, I believe already starts off without data integrity. It's broken data integrity from the outset because data is separated from its provenance, from where it came from, who wielded what device to produce this data, who was responsible for that assertion. Was that device out of calibration? Was it misconfigured? Was it? And the reason I'm bringing this up is that I think we more and more absolutely need clear provenance on data, cryptographically signed sources of data, which is obviously built in to Holochain. And then I think what this gives rise to is real ways to put an end to fake news through, and AI can be one of those things that can help us do the sifting and kind of rating and that kind of thing of sources and find patterns of miscalibration, find patterns of lies from certain sources that and be able to actually have this stuff be more reliably sifted and filtered, where right now it's just a mess.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing too there, which is part of the process by which you vet a source of data or a source of information is by crossing perspectives, by looking at things that were witnessed from other points of view. So if we've had other let's say you've got a thermometer in a room and it's reading a certain temperature reading. If we have other thermometers that are right next to it over time, we're able to say, hey man, this one seems to always be 5 degrees lower than everything else that's near it. It is in that crossing of perspectives that we're able to go, oh, maybe this is out of calibration. That's how we're able to detect failures of calibration or other sorts of failure. And for those who aren't familiar with it, crossing perspective thing for me, I just love Gregory Bateson's story around all of this. If I close one eye, or this is my telling of that, if I close one eye, I can see an image. If I close the other eye, I can see a different image. If I have both of them and I'm crossing those perspectives together, I can see depth. And that additional dimension of information comes out of comparing those two images to one another and seeing and noticing the differences. It is the difference between perspectives that gives us additional information. Trying to collapse perspective into some singular, vantage point actually undermines our ability to sense and steer. So 100% in agreement with you there, Art. All right, next up. Scepter will have a method for pluggable protocols, getting rid of brittle APIs. APIs are application programming interfaces, folks. They make it easy for one system to talk to another. So Scepter, which is what Holochain comes out of, will have a method for pluggable protocols, getting rid of APIs, brittle APIs. I understand that Holochain currently requires API bridges to be hard-coded. Is bridging in Holochain any less brittle than any other APIs? And how do you envision the evolution from bridges to complete interoperability? Art?
Yeah, so the old version of Holochain, the prototype, definitely required bridges to be hard-coded, although there was a bridge file that you could configure that stuff in. And that was true of Holochain Rust until recently, but upgrades on the implementation of our integrated security model of capabilities has made it so that the new Rust version no longer requires that bridges are hard-coded. You can still encode them in the DNA so that they automatically get set up. And if your application relies on another application, you can make that automated as a part of the setup of your app. But we use capabilities tokens to let you ad hoc add basically API bridges as a new cryptographic capability, that you write a new private entry to your source chain to create an API bridge to basically explicitly give another application the permissions to call in to this application. So this increases composability and ease of integration while still preserving our security model, because it's all through these cryptographic capability tokens. So I think that that's a huge jump already in the sort of space of dApps, being able to have these kind of easily pluggable granting of permissions between different applications, between different dApps. So I'm not aware of other blockchains or platforms that really make that very easy, but I still think it falls pretty short of the Scepter implementation, the Scepter vision of like fully self-describing, pluggable, nestable, chainable protocols, which really, I think, create more of that kind of organic resilience than the kind of brittleness that we see in today's architectures. So there is a kind of brittleness to the Holochain thing still, although it can be composed ad hoc. But part of that brittleness comes from you can't make changes to the DNA of your app anyway, without having to get everybody to be upgrading and talking to you inside of a new DNA. So I think it ends up being stable in Holochain because you're not allowed to change the DNA, but that's a different kind of brittleness. It just pushed the brittleness to a different level, where you have to get everybody to upgrade to your new version of the DNA in order to interface and have those new permissions.
Hey, Art, would this be an okay description of some of the vision for how Scepter will do that differently? I think of the pluggable protocols stuff in Scepter as almost like somebody creating a Lego block that translates, adios to goodbye, right? Or translates latitude, longitude to a street address, or probably vice versa, right? One of those, something along those lines. And that once someone has done that, others can take sort of that translator, I think of it again like a Lego block, and make use of it. Is that sort of it's not that it all happens automatically, right? It's that people pioneer sort of transformation patterns, and others go, oh, yep, that's a good one. I'm gonna return to that in situations like this. There's some social steering around all that. Thoughts, ways of expanding that?
I feel like there's a few things collapsed in there, and some of it was right on target, and some of it wasn't. So the thing that makes Scepter's self-describing protocols so cool is that what we've really done is boiled down the nature of protocols themselves, right? So in Scepter, everything is based on this repeating pattern that we see in the world of agents that can produce a signal by creating variations on a carrier. Right now, I'm doing that by pushing air through my vocal cords and shaping my mouth in different ways, which creates vibrations in the carrier of air, creates sound vibrations essentially. Now the microphone is picking this up and recording it to different digital things and that kind of stuff. So we're going through a whole bunch of transformations of carriers in order for you to actually hear me and for others to see this video. But in each case, there is an agent encoding a particular signal onto a carrier according to a protocol, right? So that you can understand the words that I'm speaking because you speak the protocol English, right? If you were in the same room as me, but others, you can also see, like we have video protocols that encode the images, and we have audio protocols that encode the sine waves and sound waves, and all of those things. If you're familiar with codecs, which are for coding and decoding things, right? You basically on both ends have to be able to translate that protocol. And so Scepter is built on this, that is a universal pattern. And we wrote a universal parser for all protocols, which is kind of a hard thing to imagine doing in the existing computing paradigm. But inside of Scepter, we have this little cheat that helps it be possible, which is that Scepter at its lowest level encodes all data as semantic trees. And what that means is that the first two passes that you would normally do in decoding something are basically already done, meaning you already know what the symbols are and you already know what the structure is. You don't lose that every time. Like in the computing world, we create the semantics or meaning for something, and then we compile, like the programmer, when they're writing code, all the code has meaning, right? Then we compile that code to run on the computer, and we lose the variable names and all that kind of stuff. And then somebody comes along and creates a database interface, and they name them new things, and they might have different validation in the database than it was in the original code. And then we transmit that over a web interface, and the web designer creates another UI and names them other things and may have different validation. And every time you are reconstructing the meaning that you got rid of when you sort of compiled and serialized it away. And that doesn't happen in Scepter. You don't have that loss of meaning. You maintain the original symbols and the original symbol structure, tree structure, essentially. And that makes it much more feasible to write a universal parser, which we call SemTrex, which is the semantic tree regular expressions, is the way that you can write your parser code, essentially. Anyway, I'm getting a little too much in depth here, technical depth, but the point of this is that when you break down protocols themselves into the most basic elements, then it turns out you can chain them together, you can plug them into different endpoints, you can nest protocols inside protocols, and that's currently hard to do in an automated way, in an automated fashion. It's very much a lot of hand fiddling with the bits. And when we talk about sort of the advantage of the self-describing aspect, is it's like if you write an edge receptor, an edge protocol that talks between Scepter and SMTP for mail relay, or HTTP, or Twitter API, or something like that, and you expose the semantics of the Twitter API, you can translate the semantics of the Twitter API into Scepter. Then any place in Scepter, any other receptor, any other module in Scepter, essentially, can consume that by being able to grab your definitions and make them portable, essentially. So it allows you allows anything inside Scepter to talk to the Twitter API once you create an edge receptor for it. And that's not currently easy. So we end up re-implementing these things all the time. You're muted. I can keep talking if you want. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to move to the next question, though.
Great. I got stuck in a window that wasn't letting me back. Sorry. I'm really grateful that we went on that little tangent, because in the holochain world, we don't really talk about Scepter a lot. In part, for the folks at home, full disclosure, we don't talk about Scepter a lot because part of why we created holochain was that Scepter is too hard to talk about for other people to really get. And we just went there a little bit, but hopefully that shows a bit of the depth. In our experience, holochain has actually been rather simple to create and build relative to all the complicated stuff that we were working on with Scepter. Awesome. Thanks, Art. Okay, next one. I'm going to throw this one back to you too. How is the quality control of the holoports going? Why wasn't that a part of the assembly process? Does every holoport need to be unpacked to pass quality control checks? Art, go ahead.
So QC has always been a part of the assembly process. But what happened was that when we actually shipped out test units to our team members and were using them in the field, that's where we found some drawbacks with the backplate and that kind of thing that weren't evident on the line, because you're not necessarily plugging and unplugging lots of devices and that kind of stuff to it. So we ended up basically having to go back and say, no, you need to fix this backplate to be a little bit better. We need another mounting screw here to tie this thing down better. And so quality control was being done. That wasn't a part of what was being checked. We didn't realize it needed to be until we tried using it in the field more. And so now all the holoports have gone through the updated quality control inspections and are being prepared to get shipped to the distribution centers now. And let me just say one thing about timing. Just because they go to the distribution centers doesn't mean you get them immediately. Sorry. We actually we have pulled probably the shipping of holoports into our closed alpha period still, rather than waiting for open alpha. We're going to do a closed alpha wave 4 for that, but we're still finishing some of the earlier waves of closed alpha to make sure that the stuff is friendly enough and usable enough for people to kind of plug and play at home.
For those at home who aren't familiar with all of that jargon, in terms of closed alpha, et cetera, these are stages of maturity in the development of the software that will be running on those hardware devices. So the hardware is getting to the distributors. We don't want to send that hardware out with immature software. We want that software to reach at least a certain level of maturity to be usable enough so that when people start using it, they have a good experience and not a bad experience. So that's where we're at. All right. What specific features of the Holochain Go prototype are yet to be implemented into Holochain Rust? Again, throwing this back to you, Art.
All right, cool. Most of the core features at this point have been implemented in Rust. That wasn't true just a couple months ago, but at this point, most of the things that you could do in Go, you can now do in Rust. And that was kind of necessary for us to build all of the Holo components that are being built on top of Holochain. So Holo Fuel for, transactions, Holo hosting, Holo, the app store, the, some basic end user apps like chat and that type of thing, key management, identity management, like all of these tools we've built as Holochain apps on top of Holochain, which has put Holochain kind of through its paces. Like, I'm not sure that anybody's going to write an app quite as complex as HoloFuel in the near future. We've uncovered a bunch of bugs that way. So most of that is there. The ones that are missing are basically to do with networking on a scalable level, and that involves also DHT sharding. We had piggybacked in the Go version on libp2p, which Protocol Labs and IPFS had built to operate on certain scales, but it didn't shard in the way that we need, and it didn't manage DHTs in the way that we need. And we basically ended up, even in the Go version, having to completely re-implement all the Kademlia and DHT stuff. And so we have come up with a different model that actually works better for our gossiping and synchronization. We're building a different DHT, RR DHT, round robin DHT, or it doesn't really stand for anything, but that's what we sometimes pretend it stands for. And that isn't ready yet. So at the moment, Holochain is not sharding. That's the main gap. However, the Rust version has also surpassed the Go version in a lot of ways, specifically with regard to unified security, encrypted, data encrypted at rest and stuff like that. Your keys being encrypted, having to password decrypt those things, improved signals and logging and testing and scalability testing, a unified server known as the conductor, so that you can share different ports. You don't have to run a different port for every app. Persistent two-way WebSocket connections, because of WASM, WebAssembly, being able to compile to WebAssembly, greater platform portability to mobile devices and browsers, pluggable persistence engine. Like there's a bunch of improvements that have been made also, not to mention that because Rust is so strict, it has probably forced us into some better practices, especially regarding concurrency and reentrant code and different things like that, that could have been bugs hidden inside the Go version.
Awesome. Thanks, Art. Okay. I know a lot of people out there, at least on the dev side or who are closer to being developers, very much appreciate that kind of insight on like, where are things at, where will they be, et cetera. Well, next up, what are the biggest roadblocks you see that would keep Holochain from becoming, quote, the next big thing in distributed computing / hosting? What are your plans regarding those issues? Thoughts, Art?
Well, the weird way to put this is that I think it's kind of the inertia of existing habits. And I would even go so far as to say some of those are bad habits that are the biggest roadblock. We've carried over a lot of patterns from centralized computing into distributed computing, and we think that they're a reality, like this global consensus aspect, and the thing we were talking about earlier about sort of the fake news thing about data having its own independent existence or truth. Like we've got a lot of habits of thinking, of coding, of exploiting relationships with software users and their data and their, all that type of stuff for revenue. And it's hard to change habits. It's hard when you rely on some of those things and you think they're the only way to do business. Making a significant change can be hard, even though intellectually, logically, we could probably argue lots of good reasons to change those things. Change doesn't happen because it's logical, right? And so, in many ways, the existence of blockchain has been kind of a mixed blessing because it's got people considering new possibilities. It's created new markets and all that kind of stuff, but it's also established a set of patterns which we have to break people out of in order to actually bring distributed things to scale. It carried forward a lot of those patterns kind of unconsciously in terms of, centralized thinking about data and independent truth of data and blah, 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 where agent-centric approaches and the kinds of paradigm shifts that essentially Holochain relies on, which is what enables it to scale, require people to think differently about it. You have to think differently when you go build an app, that you don't have all the data at your fingertips. It's spread across thousands of machines. You have to think differently about how you deal with that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of projects in the decentralized web space that I'm a fan of. There's a lot of projects that I'm not a fan of, right? But there are many projects that I'm a fan of. And I think one of the later questions touches on some of those, so I'll leave that for now. But most of the projects in the space, I think, are asking a different question than we are. I think most of the projects in the space are asking themselves, how can we do an internet that doesn't have corruption in it? And that's a good question. But I think we're asking a slightly different question, which is how can we do communication that is capable of handling complexity and confronting complexity? How can we emerge new possibilities, new ways of working together that thrive? And that's a fundamentally different question. And I think that's really at the core of why we've landed at a different place. For the folks at home, I had started a meetup community called Build the Collaborative Internet in San Francisco back in, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and met all kinds of really great people, learned lots of stuff from them. But it wasn't until I met this guy, Arthur, that I had met somebody who was trying to solve that same problem, who was really seeking ways for communities to be able to help steer and coordinate and build additional capacity to handle complexity. And that involves increasing their internal complexity, the internal complexity of the coordination of the members of the community. And so for me and my partner at that time, Jared, who's also part of the Holochain project, we basically went, oh yeah, this is somebody who gets it. And so that's where I think a lot of it comes from. I mean, it goes, the difference in thinking that the whole world is addicted to boils all the way down to the kinds of questions that you think are the right questions to ask. And so, yeah, I see an addiction to the existing paradigm that is probably I will agree 100% there. That's our biggest barrier. It's not difficulty of writing apps on Holochain. People who are web developers are going to be able to build Holochain apps, right? None of that. It's this significant worldview shift that you kind of have to go through before you can see different ways of solving problems. Once you do, there's a lot of power there, and I think that will probably quickly. But that's not a small shift to try to bring about in the world. Okay. Next up, what do you think of the skepticism regarding people's care about unenclosable carriers? I'm getting a little feedback from a mic somewhere, sorry. What do you think of the skepticism regarding people's care about unenclosable carriers and user-based inertia in general, especially with social media? I see how hard it is to get people to use better than Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook, and think they may have a point. Do you think providing a user-friendly platform without a corporation at the center will be enough? I'm going to sort of frame that a little bit for people who aren't familiar. Unenclosable carriers is part of how we talk about what we think Holochain is helping bring into the world, meaning that we're able to communicate without having a third party be able to stop us to enclose or control our ability to communicate. And so that's part of what they're referring to. And they're asking about skepticism with regard to that, and just, do people care? I hear this kind of thing about privacy as well. Art, what's your thoughts? Is it going to be enough?
I kind of feel like the last answer was already bleeding into this one, right? Like it's hard to change habits. And those habits are not just on the coder's side where you have to think differently to write an app, but also on the user's side of you have to go to a different address or do something slightly different. And definitely people need a bump. They need something to get them over, a catalyst that can lower the hurdle for them to be able to change. But I think we see more and more a building pressure toward change, right? Like where people are not necessarily happy with the status quo. And so it takes a little bit of pressure build up to bump them over that hump, but it also takes us lowering that hump, lowering that hurdle so that people can get across it. And so it's kind of a blend of those things where we have to meet people where they're at and address real pains, because actually kind of only really passionate early adopters run towards something that they want. Most of the kind of mainstream more run away from the pain that something's causing. And that pain has been building, right? The loss of privacy, the lack of control, you built your group pages for your organization on Facebook, and now they charge you to talk to your own users, or like all these different things. The pain kind of accumulates, and so I feel like the timing of this is good. I think it would be hard for some apps like Wikipedia, where I think actually the pain threshold isn't super high. A lot of people are pretty happy with using Wikipedia. Now, would it be cool if it was also peer-to-peer hosted and that kind of thing? Sure, but they're not unhappy with the organization at the center. And the organization at the center from the outset has always made it possible for somebody else to oust them. They're using open source software and they make their databases available, and somebody can come along and do a better job, right? So they've already been in a relationship of we have to extinguish the pain ourselves, and they're not abusing that, but many groups are. And so I think those abuses add up and create that motivation to change.
Yeah, I'll just add one other little thing, which is I don't think people are going to change because they feel like that because they're convinced by our rhetoric. I'll just put it that way, right? People aren't going to go, oh, I'll try this new thing because I believe in, the philosophy or whatever. I think that what's really going to drive change, at least at a broad scale, is that it being far more useful.
Yeah.
That doing applications in these ways will be so much better, and organizations that make use of them or communities that make use of them will be so much more effective in their environment that it will just kick the crap out of everybody else, whether that's countries or companies or whatever. And that will be what drives the change. It's not we convinced them with good words. Not at all. Art, you sounded like you wanted to say something there as well.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't want to downplay the ideological motivation of our early adopters, right? Like the people who are going to experiment and be willing to cut their teeth on something that isn't fully proven and all that kind of stuff. It's totally vital that we get them on board because they're part of who proves the platform and shows that it's working, which makes it safe for the next waves of people to come for exactly the reasons that we were just talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Okay. Being the guy who's always, alongside you, like running around trying to explain and convince and, talk about ideology. All right, next one. We've got what factors will ultimately push Holochain to be the most successful D-Web, decentralized web, peer-to-peer technology over the likes of Secure Scuttlebutt, DAT Network, and others. Additionally, pre-existing D-Web technologies have not garnered mainstream adoption so far. So what features or events will allow Holochain to break this mold? I'll go ahead and take this one to start, and then Art might add some comments. It doesn't have to be an either or, folks, right? Many of the technologies that got mentioned in that question are complementary to Holochain. The fact that people take trains doesn't prevent them from also using buses or bicycles. There are so many layers that are needed, and many are going to be used in combination with one another in different contexts. So for instance, some of the ways that Secure Scuttlebutt enables people to collect information from others as they're, let's say, walking around a village, like a postman picking up mail, and then passing it along to other people that they encounter as well until that message finds where it was supposed to go. Those will be really useful in certain contexts, right? That protocol came out of Dominic Tarr being on a boat and wanting to be able to do internet, even though he had poor connectivity, even though he often was offline, but he wanted to be able to kind of download things and be able to reply later, and or have that piggyback on somebody who came to visit him, and when they connect back to the regular internet, that stuff gets all shared and delivered to where it needs to go. That's an awesome use case in a particular context. We aren't focused on use cases like that at present. Doesn't mean they're not important. They are important. We're focused on a slightly different thing, which is sort of a general framework, not a platform, but a pattern for how people can run an application together as a community, can decide on a set of rules and enforce those rules, but also store and serve content that complies with those rules to one another. So yeah, I think that framing it as a will we win, the race, kind of gets it a little bit wrong. Not that there won't be projects that fail. I think a lot of the projects, particularly in the blockchain space, are not long for this world. But the ones that they just mentioned in the decentralized web space, which I think is a sort of distinct, group of software projects, those ones are I don't see them as competitors. They seem very in line with the goals that we have and the kind of world we're trying to bring about. And I know along with other people on the team, are hoping and are trying to work alongside those folks as well as we can. Like, this is definitely something where we're all trying to win in the bigger game, not the, do we capture some market share game? Art?
Oh, I saw DHT suggesting we jump to question number 12 because a few of these questions have been sort of similar, and wonder if we can jump there.
That sounds good. Let's see. Question number 12. Holo fuel supply cannot expand beyond a cap linked to hosting productive capacity. That's because hosting productive capacity will be high compared to demand, as recently explained by Art in an article, Holochain's Misstep Next Steps. What are the practical implications, and how do you see the stakeholders, mainly Holoport hosts, token holders, reacting to this situation when Holo is live? What will be the price discovery mechanism you foresee once Holo is released under current low hosting demand? Assuming hosts will at least calculate on a minimum price of hosting that covers electricity and amortization of hardware, which makes me think that initial price for Holo will never see a strong drop. Is this assumption correct? Well, first off, I want to say we're not allowed to make predictions about price. I think that's probably illegal in some way, at least not a promise around price. But Art, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, as far as I know, it's not that we're not allowed to. We're just very conservative about that. But I think we can talk about the kind of dynamics and what they mean. And for me, I think that's what's going on here is like, what kind of dynamics can we expect to play out? So I think, right away, we'll have essentially like 5,000-ish hosts, but only dozens of active apps. And because Holochain isn't blockchain, every host doesn't have to do all the same computing as every other host. So that ends up being an oversupply of hosting power. So what I think we will see is the natural behavior there is that hosts will lower their hosting charges because hosts get to set their own prices. It's a free market in that regard, an open market in that regard. So hosts will lower their hosting charges to attract more of the users to them so that they're earning something. That's the first thing that I think we're going to see. So that's a lowering of the cost of hosting, which is not the same as the price of Holofuel. We'll get to that. Then I think the obvious dynamic that emerges from that is that the price of hosting drops so much on Holo that you can see that we're actually competitive with existing cloud hosting instead of, for example, things like Ethereum, which are approximately 400 million times more expensive, or billions of times more expensive if you're talking about data storage, like versus S3 or something like that. Very expensive on blockchain. And so when app developers see a hosting platform that can run the kind of scale that we expect existing Web 2.0 apps to run on, and as cheaply, but providing all of these additional Web 3.0 benefits that get people out of those pain points of the centralized corporations controlling their identity and data, I think we will start to see more apps coming into the marketplace. And then, you get a supply-demand dynamic there, right? Which can attract more people to providing hosting. But when you're talking about hosting expenses, keep in mind that Holoports are not these huge churning GPUs that are hungry for energy and running proof of work. Like a Holoport Nano is a 10-watt device. 10 watts. That's like less than most light bulbs were. Now that we have some LED lights and that kind of stuff, we're finally down in that range. And the Holoports and Holoport Pluses are 45-watt devices. We're not talking about massive electricity charges. Plus, I think there's a whole market for people that are going to use Holoports or use Holoport OS installed to basically be able to host their own Holochain apps as a kind of backup and resilience type of thing, so that if they lose their phone or laptop that they may be running something on, they don't lose all their data, that they're actually using it to host themselves. And then then it doesn't really cost them much to make additional power that's idle power on that device available to host others. And so I think that there's actually kind of a hobbyist oriented market for holo hosting as well as a profit oriented market, which I think also leads to some different market dynamics. Like, might people offer hosting for free to nonprofits or projects like Wikipedia, or things where people think this is a worthwhile thing to support? I don't even need to charge for hosting. I'm already running this box for myself. I'll just support these other things that I want to see in the world. But then there's also the thing that I said I would address when I talked about the price of hosting dropping. I want to make clear what that actually means in terms of token dynamics or the holo fuel. So imagine if the price of gasoline in dollars was dropping significantly. Does that indicate dollars are stronger or weaker? Well, the answer is stronger. The same dollar buys you more, right? So when the hosting prices are going down, then that means the value of holofuel, the buying power of holofuel, are going up, because you can buy more hosting for the same amount of holofuel. And people somehow think of that backwards. They think because the price of hosting is dropping that the value of holofuel is dropping, but it's actually an inverse relationship. And do we know how that's actually going to play out in the market? Not exactly, but we promised in our ICO that Holo could operate at about 10,000 times cheaper than Ethereum. And we used benchmarks to figure out how much computing power that was and that kind of thing. But if this starts off with a big initial drop in hosting power, then we're probably going to be operating more like 100 million times cheaper than 10,000 times cheaper, right? So we're going to overshoot by 10,000 times our promise of 10,000 times, and potentially even more. And so how does that play out in the markets? Well, that's not up for us to say, but the chances are that if people can actually see you can run scalable apps and you can compete with cloud hosting, that plays well in the market.
All right. I think I'm out of time. I think we're out of time as well. I've got low battery here, unfortunately. Part of the downside of being outside. I'm really stoked on that stoked, surfer term there, by the way, for those listening at home. Stoked on that last answer, Art. Thank you for diving in. I know a lot of people, the material that you just covered around the dynamics of the currency system and hosting pricing is it's not stuff that people are super familiar with. And so it's easy to get lost. So thank you for really going through that clearly and in detail. Is there anything else that you want to touch on before we drop off, Art, before we say our goodbyes? Or any other questions that you feel like, that one really I wanted to get to?
I actually just want to address one piece of confusion I saw in one of the questions, which was, can any of the Go stuff be ported to Rust now that Go sort of compiles to WebAssembly and stuff like that, and can people salvage their apps that way? And I just want to say, no apps were built in Go. Holochain Core was built in Go. The apps were built in JavaScript or Lisp, which were the two things that are two languages our app engine was supporting at the time. So Go compiling to WASM doesn't really affect any of that. The new Holochain Core is built in Rust, like the old one was built in Go. And just to create confusion, new Holochain apps can also be written in Rust instead of in a separate language. And we will probably continue to add some other language support, but that isn't our priority yet. We've tried to make it modular in a way so that we can add other language support, especially to other languages that compile to WebAssembly. But first, our focus is getting Holochain Core stable, secure, scalable, and then we can add more languages.
Awesome. All right. So, Art, thank you so much for joining on this one. I don't know when we're going to have you back soon, but It was great. I'm sure people at home were grateful as well. Sorry we missed you on this one, David, but I hope Turkey and Ukraine are amazing. I know there's some vibrant communities kind of growing in those places, and I'm sure this trip will help accelerate that. So once again, I'd like to thank all of the collaborators, contributors, supporters, community builders, partners, and app and platform creators who all share the vision of a more distributed internet. We encourage you to learn about Holochain. Go ahead and check out our developer documentation at developer.holochain.org, where there are resources available to help you build your first Holochain app. Until next time, which I think is about 3 weeks from now, have a great time. I hope you get to explore Holochain, and I hope you get to have good conversations at chat.holochain.org with other community members. Ask good questions. They generally provide great answers. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye all.